Hi, I'm Mark Hoth and welcome to Swift Almanac. In the last lesson we tidied up our code, but now we need to get some data out of GitHub. GitHub has both a REST API version 3 and a GraphQL API which is version 4. Now everyone has heard of REST and probably knows how to use it, but not so many have heard of GraphQL, which is relatively new and also poorly documented for Swift. Facebook is another company which is providing access through a GraphQL API, and no doubt we'll be using that in the future. So in this tutorial we're going to install Apollo, which is a framework which allows us to make GraphQL calls to GitHub and to other GraphQL API providers, and we can set up some basic calls to get user information and a list of all of our GitHub teams. So watch closely. Okay, so we're at the GitHub developer site, and just quickly there's a REST API which is their version 3, and there's the GraphQL API which is version 4. Now with the REST API, what happens is you have an endpoint, which here is this api.github.com, and basically, depending on what you're looking to access, you'll add something to that endpoint. So if we were to access users, we will append this users and then the username, and then the response that we'll get is we're going to get all of this data. If we're after something that's a little bit more complicated, like say we want to get all of the users who are matched to our organization, then we have to do a get to get perhaps the organization, and then there's the members list, so we need to get the list of members, and then so we've got the list of members, then we might want to find out what all their email addresses are, and so we have to do another call or recursive call to get the list of all of the users' emails, and just to get their emails we've got to get all of this data coming back. There's the email field. So what GraphQL allows us to do is we only have one endpoint, and what we do is we send something like an SQL query, except it's called a GraphQL query, and rather than receiving all of the information back, then we will only receive the information that we actually request. So it's a lot more efficient, and essentially we can use links between different tables to get all of the information in one query rather than having to make successive queries, so it's a lot more efficient. Now the other thing is that Apollo is going to allow us to do what we did in core data, in that we can transfer this SQL query response into a data type, and we can use dot notation to access the parameters within the data set that we've got. So it makes coding really good, and the problem with REST, of course, is it's not very type safe. We don't know that the data is there or not. The whole point is it's a flexible framework, and we might request a field that is no longer there. We might request something that we think is a string, but it comes back as a number, etc., which means that we have to create optionals in all of our data structures, which is not ideal. But in GraphQL, it's typely cast, and what we do is we obtain a schema from our provider, in this case GitHub, and this schema basically says, it's a dictionary that basically says this is all the request types that you can make, and this is the data type for each of those properties. So because we know in advance that the properties data type, we are able to strongly type our response, and hence we shouldn't get any crashes and everything should be nice and nifty. So in order to do all this, we need a framework called Apollo, and if we go to www.apollographql.com and then go to Docs and Native iOS, you'll get a little bit of a blur and you can read a little bit about it. And then we want to go to installation, and it's a little bit out of date, requires Xcode 8, you can install from the Mac store, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we need to go into our pod file, members. I need to add a pod file for Apollo, and the current version in the repository is 0.65, and that doesn't work with Xcode 9, so we need to ask it for a beta version, or at least a version of 0.7, which is in pre-release. And if we type on install, we've installed Apollo 0.7, so that's all looking good. Now, now we have this Apollo code gen globally through npm. So what we need to do is copy this npm install -g Apollo code gen. If you don't have npm or node, then you can Google search installing node or npm. And it tells you how to install npm, and you can use this this sudo command. However, I installed it. No, that's not what I'm after. Just copy that. Oh, and I've made the first mistake. Anyway, we'll get some errors, no doubt. No, it's working so far. We'll see. It may be that we need to put a sudo command at the start of that. Anyway, then we have to add this code generating build step. So essentially what's going on is we're going to write a GraphQL request, and we're going to write a GraphQL request, and then this code gen is going to take our graph request and it's going to create a file called api.swift, which is going to be our Swift type checking code, which will allow us to do the dot notation. So if you remember back to our core data example, then we chose the class extension, which the system created a class with properties for all of our tables and field value names. So this does the exact same thing. So in order to invoke this code, we have to go to the build process. So we go to members, and then we go to build phases, and tick the plus icon and choose new run script phase. So the plus icon is up here, new run script phase, and we want to rename this to something like GraphQL and open it up. Well, they've got this whole thing that they want to call it, so we can change it. You can name it whatever you want, but we may as well be consistent. And then add the following contents to the script area below the shell. So we copy all of this, and we put type of script or drag here. So put that in place. And it says this script above will invoke the Apollo code gen, which we just installed with npm, and through the check and run apollo.codegen.shell wrapper script, which is actually contained in the Apollo framework bundle, which we installed with our pod file. And the main reason for this is to check whether the version of Apollo CodeGen installed on your system is compatible with the framework version installed on your project, and to warn you if it isn't. Without this check, you could end up generating code that is incompatible with the runtime code in the framework. So we've done that, but the other thing we need to do is we need to generate these files prior to compiling sources. So you just click and drag to move that up to the correct location. So that has installed Apollo. What is this asking me to do? Build settings. Yes, we'll perform that change. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we need to get a schema file, and conventionally this file is called schema.json. So this schema, or a schema, is a representation of our database, and our database is GitHub. So GitHub has this schema introspection, what this basically allows us to do is make a query to tell us exactly what we need to, well, we're going to run a query which is going to return to us the entire schema of GitHub that we can access. So there is some code for doing this, but what we will need to do is we will need to obtain a bearer token as part of this process. So under our let's go to GitHub. So under our settings for our organization, or maybe it's not even an organization, maybe it's just the developer. Personal access tokens, that's one I created. Okay, so we just generate a new token. We'll whip in our password and just put a token description, GraphQL2. What is this token for? So we need to access repositories, we need users, and we need to administer our organization. And we generate a token, and this token is going to be created. Obviously I've already got another one, but I'm going to use this one for this project, but this other one is the one that is secret and you won't be able to use. So we want to copy that to our notepad. So we've copied our token to our notepad, and make sure you copy for your personal access token. Now you won't be able to see again. So when we move to a different page. Next time we come back, it's gone, and currently it's never been used. Okay, so now that we have our access token, we can go to this adding a schema file to your target directory in the Apollo GraphQL.com site, and when you download a schema, it will say, give you this command line, which is going to ask you for the bearer token. So we copy that bearer and then go back to our notepad, copy our token, put another quote to finalize things, and hit return. And voila, we have a schema.json file. And what we want to do is we want to add it to our project. Let's see where it is. Yes, I'm one level up, so I just want to kind of move it there. I can't at the moment. Okay. So schema.json, we'll put in members. And if we have a look, it's got a whole heap and a very long heap of JSON files in it. So now that we know, and as I said earlier, what this is telling us is that there are a whole heap of tables with a whole heap of fields, and it's telling us what the values of those fields are, whether they're scalar or an object, or whether they're non-null, booleans, etc. So that allows us to do the type checking that we need. So we can build. So let's build, see what happens. Okay, so that's looking good. So once we've built the application, it's going to be running this build phase that generate the Apollo GraphQL API. And now if we look under members and we go add file again, that process will have created this API.swift file, which we'll add to our project. And as you can see, it currently does nothing because we haven't created any files of the GraphQL type. So we've added that, and essentially every time we create a file called .graphql, as part of the build process, it is going to regenerate this API.swift file, and it's going to create data structures based on the SwiftQL requests that we're making in our SwiftQL files. Add-ons. Basically, if you want type checking in your .graphql files, then you can follow this process to do it. And then it says create GraphQL files with queries or mutations. So basically what a query is if you're wanting to just read from the database, then you create a query. And a mutation, of course, is making a change. So if you want to add, update, or change information, then you create a mutation. So let's create a GraphQL file and do a basic query. So we create a new file. We just want it to be an empty file, and we'll call it users.graphql. And it's just going to be a text file, and essentially our query is sort of looks like this, but doesn't have any formatting. So we're going to make a query which is basically a read from our database, and the format is, this is the name of the function. So our function is called getUserQL, and this is the table we're going to make a request to, which is our user table, and we want to find someone who, well, all the records where the login is my name, Mark Hoth, and this is the values that we wish to return, and we're going to return my name and my email address, which is pretty straightforward. So what we want to do is we want to build this again. And as you can see, our API.Swift has now created a class called getUserQL query. So getUserQL, it's appended query, keyword, to form a class, and then as part of the class, it's created these properties, and that allows us to do just like we did in core data, allows us to use the dot notation to access these fields when they return. So what we want to do now is we want to go to GitHub, and we want to create a function to get user information. Now at the top here we need to import Apollo. Then we want to get an instance of this class, this getUserQL query. So we just go let getUserQL equals getUserQL query, and then the other thing we need to do is we need to set up an instance of Apollo. So up here as part of my GitHub, we create an Apollo client, and this is just using the URL session configuration, the default version, and the configuration, we need to add our bearer token, which we saved to our notepad before, and that'll create a URL, and then we also need to create a URL for our GitHub GraphQL endpoint, and there's only one of those, and then basically we're going to return this network transport and configuration. So I'll set up these constants, and if we go back to it'll tell us that our graph endpoint is this. So every time we're making a call to Apollo, we're going to be sending, it's always going to be going to this GraphQL, and we're always going to be using this bearer token. So now that we've got our wrapper all set up here, we can just say Apollo dot, and oops, as you can see, just like core data, there is a fetch request, and we pass this GraphQL query, which is called, of course, getUserQL from above. And then we need a closure for when things return. It's going to return a result and an error. And we can print the result. print the error. And then we're going to get a user. We're going to get result dot data dot user. Now, if we're going to need a couple of optional chains in there. Now, if we don't get that, if we get a nil value, then we've got no data. So back in our users request, we're after a user who's called Mark Hoth. So if I wasn't there, and otherwise we will just print username and the email. And as you can see, because this API.Swift has got this class, we know the data structure that we're getting returned. It's got these values. It's doing mappings for user, for name and email. And so our compiler is type checking everything for us. So it knows that these things exist. So we'll run this. So it is all compiling. Giving me some errors for these, or some warnings at least for these print statements, but they're not going to be in the final code. Now, the only thing we haven't done is we haven't actually called getMarkUser. So we're automatically logging in our app. So if we go to main view controller and our view.load, we will call mygithub.shared.getMarkUser, and we will run it this time. There you go. We've got username optional Mark Hoth, and it's got my email address. So we've got these variables. It's all working. Now the next thing we can do is we can add additional queries. I've done one to get a list of all of the teams for the organization. So again, it's a query just getting the information, and just put some formatting in so we can see what's going on. So our function name is going to be called getOrgTeams. We're accessing the organization table, and the organization table, we want the organization called Swift Almanac. And within organization, there will be a list of teams, and we want to return the first 30. We currently only have 6, so I don't really need to worry about this, but the whole point of having a large number of potential records is that you don't want to necessarily get all of them. You might want to get them in groups of 30. In fact, a GraphQL API at GitHub typically returns a maximum of 30 records, so you can change these variables to get and run them in a loop to get all of the records if you need all of the records. So in Teams, there will be this node, which is like a relationship to for all the people who are in the team, and we want the names of all of the people. So we're going to get returned an array of up to 30 items. So how does that look as some programming? Again, if we do a simple build, the build's going to force us to run through this build phase. We're going to generate some APIs. And so now when we look in our API.swift, we have the, still at the top, we have the get user QL query, but further down we have now the get org teams query, and it's created all of the data structures, etc., etc., etc. that we need. So go back to my GitHub and we can create another function. So we've got another function called getTeams. It's basically duplicating exactly what we had in the previous function, except now we've got a lot more data that we need to go through, and we are getting returned this teams array. So we're going through each team to print out the team name. We're not actually after the users in the team. I mispronounced that. So we're just after the name of all of the teams that we have. So again, we need to call getTeams from our main view controller. And we'll run that. And there you go. We've got our team names coming back. They're still coming back as optionals, but we can sort that out. And then we've got all these teams, which are going to be called Beginners Swift, Blockchain, the Channel app, Firebase, iOS Advanced, and iOS Beginners. So what we want our app to do is we want people to be able to access free content, but for more advanced content, we want them to be able to sign up to one of our teams. So what I want to do is I want to set up an interface next, and that interface is going to have obviously a nav bar, and it's going to have a tab bar at the bottom, and these records that we're getting returned from GitHub are going to allow us to fill in a table which will allow you to select which groups you wish to be able to access. Anyway, that is sort of the very basics of getting GraphQL working, and obviously as we develop the app, we'll be building more queries, and we'll also be building some mutations so that we can actually save the data back to GitHub. And the other thing is that obviously these values here are hard-coded, so we'll also be showing you how to use variables to pass values to these queries. So now we can make calls to GitHub using GraphQL. If you have any questions about this tutorial, then leave a comment below or check out our website at www.swiftalmanac.com. Don't forget to like the lesson if you've learned something. I'm expecting plenty of likes in this lesson, and subscribe to the channel for more valuable content. It is free, and see you next time. Cheers.